Good, beautiful day, you believers, non-believers, unaffiliated believers, sort of believers, and even you think I'm a believers. Welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor, a podcast where we welcome converts, but where we think like disciples, a show where we address things about which today's church is both terrified and silent. Normally slow to virtue signal, I'm feeling good about meself. Yep, I'm helping to stick it to Dracul Putin. Yep, I just went and filled up my car. And at $4.50 per gallon here in Spudlandia, when I put that nozzle into my gas tank, I knew I was shoving it down Putin's throat. You know me. I just want to help Stammer and Uncle Joe and Aunt Kamala BS word salad and scolding school marm Jen Sock stick it to the Ruskies. 'Cause they know how to make Vlad pay. Hey, what's the BS there in Kamala's name for? Bologna sandwich. What did you think? And man, it's just great. Every time I buys gas, I feels I'm gonna make you pay, Putin. And it's just so simple. Just put your credit card in the slot thingy, punch in a few responses, and begin drilling right into Vlad Putin's malignant heart by filling your tank. Oh, but then a weird thing happened while I was filling. You know when you look at the gas pump display, and you can see the price per gallon and the total cost rolling on as the gallons go in? Well, I made a silly mistake. What did you do, Ed? I touched the screen right where the amount is tallying. I touched that part of the display screen and scorched my finger. It was scalding hot. Apparently the numbers were racing so fast, going up so fast, that the pump screen couldn't handle the resultant heat. I burned my finger. And that was only after $55 worth. Oh, I live in the land of idiocracy. Seriously. Did you ever see the movie Idiocracy? Written by the Coen brothers, it was a comedy when they first produced it in 2006, but today it's a straight-up political drama. Almost a one-for-one with how things are going with what too much of the populace is like. We have total lib clods running the country, and it's clear. Biden is fighting dementia. Lord, give him clarity. But if you've watched it all for 50 years, you'll know he never was the sharpest tool in the shed. Political wonks always saw Joey Grifter as a bumpkin among the more refined liberal types. Still, all that? Everything is going to be okay. Joe still has a 39% approval rating. Gosh, that's amazing. 39% of America actually approves of this slot show? Oh, and get this. Joe Biden's approval rating went up 1% following his State of the Union speech. I don't know what stammer and pitch those 3.2 million people were watching, but man, idiocracy. Gasoline is already at record highs. Nationwide, will it hit $6 per gallon? And of course, fuel prices drive up the cost of everything. So hold on to your hat. Inflation is roaring down the tracks at us. And I wonder, what on earth will happen across the next 3 years? Holy shnikes. Ladies and Duden, want to help me? Tell a believing friend about the UU. Tell intellectually starved Christian family and friends there is a podcast where they won't be talked to like they're in the 5th grade. Wholeheartedly, thanks for your help. Well, what about Ukraine? Just evil. I hope not. Did you see the picture of a mom, Tetiana Parabienis, and her 2 children and a friend laying dead on the street side in Irpin? It ran in the New York Times. Yeah, trying to evacuate, they were murdered by a Russian mortar. It's grievous. Another blatant war crime. And it appears to be an intentional strategy. Blast civilians to smithereens. bodies by the dozens being tossed into mass graves. Putin either means to destroy the nation of Ukraine, a kind of punishment for its arrogance against his own conceit, or he's acting wild, bombing apartments, grocery stores, evacuation routes, in order to make the West fearfully wonder, would this madman actually nuke us? Either way or both, it's demonic. Putin is a war criminal, and I pray God brings down heavenly justice on him. But you guys, for all of that, be slow to believe everything the media is ubiquitously running up the flagpole. The major media that lied to us for 2 solid years about the media complicit in the stealing of a presidential election, the media that glosses over every unbelievable White House absurdity, they didn't suddenly grow a conscience and start speaking truth. No, the media is a fire hose of propaganda. When all the media spout the same thing, be on your guard. Oh, and this is pertinent to the Ukraine war situation, so I'll broach it now here too. Kamala Harris, on 2 separate public occasions now, has described the situation like this. A bigger, more powerful country, Russia, invaded a smaller, weaker country, Ukraine. You guys, I ran into that mindset across my last 10 years of teaching. And I single out those last 10 years because it was during that span when I realized I was encountering a fully flowering, fruit-bearing, postmodernist worldview. But here's Kamala's POMO logic. Big equals bad, little equals good. Big equals oppressor, small equals noble victim. Now, you and I know that is juvenile silliness. But ardent postmodernists like Kamala have been so programmed by progressive ideology, are so much the product of a relativistic and relativizing education, are that incapable of describing a layered situation that she relegates it to a matter of big and small. Right? I mean, the POMO thinking goes, big corporations are bad, while mom and pop businesses are small. All rich people are evil, while all poor people are good. All white people are nefarious, while all people whose skin is not white are noble. And no, don't you dare point out that the Democrats have for, 20 years now sided with the big corporations over the mom and pop businesses. Don't you dare, in the name of all things PC, point out that the progressives have done everything in their power for 2 years to aid the rich and brutalize the middle class. Don't you dare commit PC blasphemy by pointing out that blacks commit far more crimes per capita than whites. 'Cause if you do any of that, you're either an imperialist or a racist.
Wait, now we're supposed to positively judge people by their skin color?
And, per always, here's been the billboard-sized tell that lets you know the POMO worldview is inebriated with falsehoods. The biggest monster, biggest violator of human rights, the biggest eating machine to wound and erase human rights? Big government. But just once in your life, have you ever heard a POMO arguing against big government? Me neither. And look it, I understand the disdain for big business. Amazon is killing mom and pop businesses by the hundreds every day. But if you can't see that big government is the most immediate threat to the existence of our freedoms and liberties and flourish, then you're blind. And then, to Kamala's assessment, it's not just that Russia is big while Ukraine is small. It's that Putin is evil while the government of Ukraine is less evil. Zelensky has been on the take with money for years. A nation can be geographically massive, Brazil, and be benign. A nation can be geographically small, North Korea, and be unspeakably evil. But then, disciples who can think with nuance, We already know all that. That we have a vice president incapable of saying that? It's terrifying. On the foreign angle, here's a few elements that I think are important for understanding the war in Ukraine. At the 40,000 foot level, weakness leads to suffering. This is so obvious now after 10,000 years of human existence. We live in a fallen world. If you give them the welcome mat, if they're left unchecked, dictators become tyrants. And tyrants are impossible to placate with niceness, hugs, tokens of love, and generous big business deals.
Let's hit that big red reset button.
Dictators do respect power. The West has played nicey nice with Russia and China now for the last 30 years, pretending they could be our allies, pretending they don't assassinate their own political rivals at home. And all that Western weakness has emboldened both China, Lord God protect Taiwan, and Russia, both of them to behave with the usual dictatorial aggression. On the international front, weakness leads to suffering. And 'cause this is a show about a Christian worldview, let me explain further. There is a widespread progressive Christian notion that government should never use power, shouldn't have missiles or nuclear submarines or armies. Governments, in the Pomo Christian mentality, should only exist to pass out, air quotes, free stuff to the folks. Governments shouldn't even defend national borders. But guys, the Christian worldview isn't naive. That Jesus exhorted us to live peaceably, that he told us to turn the other cheek when encountered by evil, is not even a one-for-one with allowing military wickedness to bomb women and children by the 10,000s. The Christian worldview is suffused with righteousness, is acutely aware of the human propensity toward evil. The Christian worldview is not one where we blithely sigh when a hospital is shelled by a wicked dictator. No, we who follow the risen Christ, we assess reality with nuance. And we know at the international level that projections of weakness only lead to greater, longer-lasting suffering. But let me continue with my foreign assessment. All the talk about Ukraine joining NATO, that was, now we know, bad for Ukraine. Russia and Putin and Russia views Ukraine as traditionally Russian territory. I mean, it belonged to Russia for some 300 years. Russia was hardly going to allow yet another former member of the USSR to join NATO. My son told me that Michael Malkin, himself of Ukrainian descent, said we can liken this to something akin to if China tried to make Texas part of China, encouraging Texas to secede from the Union, preparing Texas to take political and economic positions opposed to the USA. The American government would never stand for that. Neither did Putin stand for Ukraine joining NATO or even hearing the talk about it. And that NATO angle does not, in my mind, excuse Putin's invasion of Ukraine. It does help us see it in its historic context. Here's another facet on the foreign angle. Not one American soldier should go on the ground in the Ukraine. Now, it wounds me to say that. But at a critical level, we do not want World War III. Look, this is all on Europe's border. If foreigners are going to get involved militarily, it needs to be assistance first from Europe. Europe needs to determine whether Putin will stop at the borders of Poland and Romania, Slovakia and Hungary, and then take action. But we don't need more American troops fighting battles on foreign soil. Again, it grieves me to say that. What would I do? I'd send the MiGs to Ukraine. I'd allow Ukraine to defend themselves with fighter jets. Send them anti-tank weapons, attack drones, medicine, help them establish supply lines. Don't just let them get bombed to smithereens. But in the end, feckless Europe, indulgent Europe, morally and religiously apathetic, philosophically relativistic Europe needs to decide to get involved. The power brokers in Brussels, headquarters for the EU, they have to make a damnable for them decision to get involved militarily, and they need to have made that decision long before American boots touch Ukrainian soil. The first reference in the Bible to giants? Genesis 6, 1 through 4. Divine beings looked at fair women, came down from heaven, mated with those women, and produced the Nephilim. I've established that and more in the last 2 episodes. These half men from the female mothers and half spirits from the sons of God, those who formerly sat on God's council in Eden. Again, if you're jumping in right here without listening to my last 2 podcasts, this will seem bewildering. These half men and half spirits were Nephilim. The Nephilim, the rest of the Old Testament and the Jewish Septuagint and the Jewish apocryphal book Enoch tell us were giants. Oh, and it seems the word Rephaim is a synonym for Nephilim. Or scholars say it's possible that the Rephaim and the Nephilim were different generations of giants. But these giants, some of them, enough of them to continue reproducing, survived the flood. That explanation works if the great flood of Noah was a localized Mesopotamian event. It takes too much work, too greater supposition of having giant genetic bloodlines working somehow unexplained, osmosis, through the genes of Noah's immediate flood-surviving family to thereby explain the post-flood existence of giants. In Genesis 6, the whole world was a phrase used to explain that the flood was devastating, destructive of the entire region. And that giants survived the flood makes sense again, because the Old Testament goes on both to show us the existence of giants and then refer back to them, in case of the prophetic books like Amos, to the existence of the giants, the Nephilim. Well, man, that summary's way too fast, but that's the background for today's show. Oh, Gersh, I can already anticipate the blowback. But Ed, Genesis 7 says, the rain fell on the earth 40 days, and all flesh that moved on the earth, animals and human beings, died. And quote, God blotted out everything on the face of the ground. So, Ed, careful. If you don't believe the flood was global, if you don't believe the flood covered the entire earth, then you're denying the authority of the Bible. I mean, you guys, I can hear that critique already. But here's the deal. You can challenge me with that, but then you still have to explain to me how giants survived after the flood. Did the sons of God come down again later and have sex with still more women? Because you have no textual evidence that occurred. So your interpretation, playing this gotcha game, doesn't account for the later Bible's repeated reference to the existence and corruption and violence and abomination of giants. That gotcha game works both ways. Is the Bible lying to say there were post-flood giants? No, we need to be careful, respectful. And me, I'm comfortable with the most plausible explanation of post-flood giants existing on earth because some of them, made it to some hilltop, or managed somehow to flee Mesopotamia and survive, or they had earlier emigrated outside Mesopotamia? I don't know. But I'm choosing the most plausible explanation. And I love Scripture. Now, in earlier episodes we saw, following the scholarship of Michael Heiser, who himself is openly following decades and dozens of other Hebrew and ancient scholars, we saw that the Apkallu, also known as the Nephilim, also known as the spirits inside giants, came from the abyss in the pagan worldview, or came from the divine council in the biblical Genesis worldview. So, where did those spirits go when they died? Do you enjoy the UU show? Well then, throw this old dog a bone. $4, $6, $26, $44, any of that per month would greatly help me pay for monthly costs. It would encourage me. It would help us to promote the podcast elsewhere. You can go to Patreon, Patreon. Go to the Uncensored Unprofessor, make a pledge there at Patreon. Thanks, you guys. So where did those spirits go when they died? Well, they are, first Enoch shows us, demons that roam the planet today. The spirit side of former Nephilim, those giants, continue to wreak havoc among humans today. They hate us. I just watched a near-death experience from a man who used to be a pilot, and I may bring some of his experience into a later episode on good angels, but he talked about this creature he saw on the other side during his near-death experience, and it was filled with rage. It was filled with hate. Those dark creatures loathe us. They long to see us corrupted and ruined and tormented and sent with them to hellfire. Now, am I dogmatic about that? Well, I'm dogmatic that they hate us. The scriptures are not unclear on that point. Am I dogmatic that demons are former spirits of giants? No, it's not a point of dogma for me. But it's also not impossible either. But that's not really the end of the issue. That's not the end of the story as we think about giants and their spirits. The Bible shows that some spirits have already been thrown into Tartarus, also known as the Netherworld, also known as Hades, also known as a place that is not yet hellfire and not yet eternal hell. We commonly think this is all awaiting future completion, but some spirits have already been thrown into spiritual prison. We get a glimpse of this reality when Jesus encountered a demoniac. You can read about it in Mark 1 or Luke chapter 4. In a Capernaum synagogue, a demonized man saw Jesus and cried out, "Excuse me, isn't that amazing?" Here they were in a place of learning and someone cried out in horror. That happened inside my classrooms on much more than one occasion.
Rebarchek, how dare you speak so boldly? Who do you think you are to suggest there is real truth?
So, to the Yaz, I get it. A man crying out in horror in a place of learning? Been there, seen that. Anyway, I gotta stop being silly here. A demonized man saw Jesus and cried out, "What do you have to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." What a confession, right? It didn't proclaim Jesus as a social justice prophet. But the demons continued. "Have you come to apolesai, terminate us?" Jesus, avoiding conversation with an unclean spirit, an unclean being, Jesus says, "Be silent and come out of him." The existentially tortured man, us, was possessed by multiple unclean spirits. And what were those spirits afraid of? That Jesus would terminate them, destroy them. And how? How would Jesus do that? By throwing them into A, the lake of fire, which they know is their final destination, or B, by throwing them into Tartarus, the netherworld, underworld prison where other sons of God have been kept now for millennia, a place that may not be Gehenna yet, but which may well be miserable, given the unclean spirits encountering Jesus did not want to go there. And also we get that notion of ongoing imprisonment directly told to us in 2 Peter 2:4. Writing about the inevitable judgment of God that awaits false Christian teachers who, they will even deny the master, it says in verse 1. Man, and I know this will sound harsh, but those churches and pastors that deny the identity of Christ, they have an inevitable judgment of God that will befall them in the life to come. And that's not me saying that, that's Peter. And Peter's only quoting Jesus on that. Anyway, writing about false Christian teachers, 2 Peter 2:4 makes reference to a past and certain judgment. It says, "For if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into Tartarus." That often gets translated in English as hell, but that's way too fast. That's sloppy. God cast them into Tartarus and committed them to chains of deepest darkness to be kept until judgment, 2 Peter says. And continuing, and even though he did not spare the ancient world, that is, from the corruption of the sons of God, even though he did save some, like Noah, in the midst of a flood, wait, God did not spare which angels? The angels, verse 4, the sons of God who were alive at the time of the Noahic flood. Again, that's verse 5. And we should ask, because questions lead to answers, from whence would Peter get the notion of sons of God alive at the time of Noah and the flood? Well, from Genesis 6, and as we saw last episode, building on Genesis 6, from 1 Enoch. Yous guys? Here we have the New Testament affirming what variously the Old Testament and 1 Enoch and the Septuagint have already shown us, as I unpacked in prior episodes. The New Testament doesn't rid itself of that supernaturalized ancient Jewish worldview or a Second Temple Jewish worldview. No, the New Testament affirms that the unclean spirits which encountered Jesus in the synagogue knew that other unclean spirits were already in the dreadful, dark spiritual holding bin, already in the netherworld, already in a holding prison, awaiting the final judgment before God, the final judgment of eternal hellfire. Hellfire that Jesus himself said was, in Matthew 25:41, was prepared for the devil and his angels. And we should be clear. Jesus himself is affirming and referencing the first Enoch notion that hellfire had been created for sinful divine beings. But back to 2 Peter. Again, how did Peter know that ancient judgment of the corrupt angels had already happened? That God had already cast some Apkallu, some sons of God, into Tartarus? Because of 1 Enoch. I read it last week, but it now bears repeating. 4 archangels, Michael, Sariel, Raphael, and Gabriel, had cried out to God regarding the divine, or better, the corrupted divine wickedness that was then wrecking the earth. God hears the cries of those 4 archangels. What does God do? He tells the archangels to go and round up the offending watchers, also known as the sons of God, again these divine council members, and bind them. Go, God says in 1 Enoch, and bind them until the day of their judgment and consummation, until eternal judgment is consummated. Then, at that time, they will be led away to the fiery abyss, to the torture, and to the prison where they will be confined forever. And at the time of the judgment, where I, Yahweh, will preside, they will perish for all generations. So, go, destroy all the spirits of the half-breeds and the sons of the watchers, because they have wronged men. That's 1 Enoch, chapters 10 through 11. And again, to be clear, you guys, because it's important, Peter takes Genesis 6, 1 through 7 literally. Peter takes seriously the Old Testament passages about how sons of God, members of God's divine council, corrupt the earth. I'll talk more about that next week. Peter takes the standard Jewish literal view of Genesis 6 and 1 Enoch and the Septuagint's interpretation of those as giants. All of that is true. So did Jesus. That's fascinating, right? But get this. It wasn't only Jesus or Peter who affirmed 1 Enoch on an already accomplished spiritual judgment, punishment where angels had been thrown into Tartarus. So did Jude. And like 2 Peter, Jude uses the accounts of Genesis 6 and 1 Enoch to warn his readers about what God is going to do to, quote, intruders, wolves, those who pervert the grace of God into licentiousness. That is, who use the grace of God to excuse or sanction wanton sexual immorality, something that the Apostle Paul has to deal with in several of his letters. Let me read you a few verses. Here's Jude, verses 5 through 7. I want to remind you, though you already know, that the Lord, who once for all saved a people out of Egypt in the Exodus, afterward destroyed those who did not believe, that is, the generation with Moses, right, that perished in the wilderness for their disbelief, their disobedience. And the angels who did not keep their own position at the divine council, but left their proper dwelling, right, from heaven, my listener, from heaven, that is, hearkening the corruption that the Old Testament sees resulting from angels having sex with women. God has kept them in eternal chains in deepest darkness for the judgment of the great day. Jude continues. Similarly, Sodom and Gomorrah, which you guys hear is being appealed to as those cities always are referenced, for horrific sexual sin. Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which in the same manner indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural lust, or Old Testament speak, corrupting lust. They serve as an example of God's judgment by undergoing a punishment of eternal, endless fire. End quote. That's Jude, a member of the apostolic community, echoing what Genesis 6 said about angels who had polluting and corrupting sex with women, and echoing the Old Testament on multiple locations. I need to walk you through some of those, and echoing and affirming 1 Enoch on the ancient judgment of members of God's divine council, who are now in chains, down in deepest darkness, awaiting the final judgment of Gehenna. Eternal tormenting fire of brimstone. And at the expense of seeming repetitive, I want to emphasize a couple of things for you here. First, 2 Peter and Jude and Jesus across his ministry, we'll note some instances of this in later episodes, those three together and still more New Testament writings all believe that what we read in Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is indeed about divine beings choosing to come down and have intercourse with women. A sin that is corrupting, defiling. But each of these New Testament references, personages, are also affirming what we've learned about 1 Enoch. God has already taken some of the corruptive divine sons of God and cast them into chains into Tartarus, a dark holding bin for sinful angels. When did that happen? Well, apparently at the time of or after the flood, when these sinful angel giant Nephilim were on the earth. So that's a first point to stop and think with you about. A second point? We see the New Testament affirming the information of a non-biblical book, 1 Enoch. Now this is a nuanced point. So if you're only half listening right now, you'll misunderstand things important regarding divine revelation. The Bible, inspired of the Holy Spirit, can, and now we know does, incorporate information, events, truths, quotations that were not originally inspired. We already saw that Genesis 6 took earlier Mesopotamian language about divine beings as heroes and critiqued, harpooned that, so that the Opkalu, having come down and mated with women, was shown to be an abomination, not a blessing. Or still earlier, Genesis 1 takes the ancient worldview of polytheism, sun, moon, stars, animals, all as gods, and recasts those in the truth as all being under the sovereign lordship of Yahweh, the one Lord. The Bible takes outside knowledge and uses it for the glory of God. Or, in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul repeatedly quotes older Greek poets who were not only not Hebrews, they were not even devout monotheists. He does that in Acts 17:28 with the Greek philosopher Epimenides and another one named Aratus, saying, "In him we live and move and have our being, as some of your poets have said, for we are also his children." Paul does it again in 1 Corinthians 15:33. He quotes Menander, "Bad company corrupts good morals." He does it still again in Titus 1:12, again quoting Epimenides or Gnosis. He says, "Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons." And Paul quotes those Greek poets to connect or to bridge to the Gentiles in order to help bring them to the gospel. First Enoch, a Jewish apocryphal book, and for your information, I explain what apocrypha means in episode 250, both in terms of history and authenticity. First Enoch is affirmed by Jesus, Paul, and I may explain that in a future episode, Peter and Jude, even though First Enoch was neither part of the Old Testament nor even part of the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint. My point is, again, that the Bible doesn't always speak sui generis, in totally new, never before heard of, one-of-a-kind manner. It interacts with the surrounding worldview. It often affirms the truth and goodness and beauty of the surrounding worldview, but it is also not shy about prophetically criticizing and shaming and judging the spiritually darkened worldview that surrounds it. I guess it might be helpful to see the Bible itself as salt and light. Jesus told us to be salt and light, healing, washing agents, renewing agents, moral agents, because God's written word is itself salt and light. Just as Jesus himself was God's supreme salt and light. And our Hebrew scholar, Michael Heiser himself, does not take First Enoch to be inspired, but he takes the Bible's use of First Enoch indeed to be inspired. And I call that good form, careful form. But allow me to go back. Tartarus, a spiritual holding place in the Netherworld. In classical Greek mythology, remember, Jesus and the apostles lived in a Hellenized, Greekified milieu. In classical Greek mythology, Tartarus was a place lower than Hades. The website Greek Mythology says some accounts say the distance between Tartarus and Hades was the same as between the earth and the heaven. And that website continues. Although the kingdom of Hades was the place of the dead, Tartarus was where ferocious monsters and horrible criminals were banished, or where the gods imprisoned their rivals after a war. End quote. 2 Peter is taking that Hellenized idea about a spiritual netherworld prison and overlaying it across First Enoch on spirits thrown into prison to inform us that the spirits in Tartarus are doomed. And when they finally are released, it will be to stand in judgment before Yahweh, who will then cast them into Gehenna, eternal hellfire. Having said all that, I gotta give you still more Tartarus-related reflection. Nowhere does the Bible show us that Lucifer is the Lord of hell or Tartarus. He won't be the king of hell in the future, and he's not the king of Tartarus now. In Matthew 25:41, Jesus refers to Satan as the head of the demons. He says, "He will say to them, 'Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels.'" So the devil, Satan, may be the leader of demonic activity, but he does not sit on a throne in hell or in Tartarus. I don't remember. Who was it? Augustine? Thomas Aquinas? Who said, hell is God's hell. God, the Lord, Yahweh. Jesus is the Lord of heaven and earth and Tartarus and hellfire. We must be clear on this. Any spiritual being now imprisoned in Tartarus is not actively doing anything here on earth. And to think aloud here, as if I'm not thinking aloud with you all the other times we spend quality time together, to think aloud here that the demonic realm has been judged, but has yet to be finally judged, mirrors what the scriptures say, John's gospel particularly, also Paul in his writings, what the scriptures say about godless human beings. They're already judged, but they await final judgment. God didn't create Gehenna, the lake of fire, hell, for people. But those who finally side with evil, those who finally deny Christ, their destination, Jesus said, is the same as the sons of God who, leaving their appropriate dwelling in heaven, had violated God's plan for themselves and human beings. Indeed, it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Hebrews 10:31. Well, that's some stuff on Tartarus, that spiritual holding place, that place that the four archangels took demons, some of those demons, those spirits of giants. Next week, we'll talk about how the Nephilim polluted the land and how, following the Tower of Babel, God chose to cleanse the land that had been polluted by those evil Apkallu. I hope you're enjoying this. I'm learning a ton. It's helping me to see the New Testament even in a much different light. It's also vivid. But I want to thank you so much for listening. Please, everyone, go now and turn your beautiful God-given brains on.